Hello and welcome to Conference Connections. My name is John Turner and I am the Manager of Community Development and Research at the Nebraska Investment Finance Authority. Also joining me today from NIFA is Elizabeth Fimbries, the Communications and Outreach Manager. Those of you that have worked with NIFA know that we have a Housing Innovation Marketplace Conference every year that features speakers locally and from across the country to talk about housing-related topics and solutions. Due to the pandemic, our conference was canceled and we are offering our sessions via webinar for you all today. I would like to take this time to feature the following conference sponsors and exhibitors. Those are Churchill Stateside Group, Genworth Mortgage Insurance, Prairie Reed Construction, and Housing and Urban Development, also known as HUD. All of our webinars are available on our website under the Community Development page under Outreach and Action, or you can access our videos on NIFA's YouTube channel, NIFA Housing. Today's presentation on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls was scheduled to be one of our keynote topics. We are very grateful to have with us today Kirby Williams, member of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma and outreach coordinator for the Native American program with Legal Aid of Nebraska. Kirby's knowledge and expertise in addressing violence and trauma supports her work to raise awareness and promote the prevention of domestic violence, sexual assault, human trafficking, and stalking. She currently focuses the majority of her work on serving Native American survivors of these crimes. Kirby has conducted numerous trainings and presentations addressing violence against Native Americans, including with the National Human Trafficking Leadership Academy, the Nebraska Victim Assistance Academy, the Nebraska State Patrol, and in other areas throughout the United States serving tribal communities. For her work in violence prevention, she was named as an inaugural recipient of the Cherokee Phoenix's 7 Feathers Award in 2019. Kirby also serves as a commissioner for the City of Omaha for the Nebraska Commission on Indian Affairs. We ask that you save questions until the end of the presentations. Please use the question feature during the presentation, and NIFA staff will ask those questions at the end of the presentation. So Kirby, thank you for joining us, and I will turn it over to you.
Okay, well, thank you for that very nice introduction. I am going to attempt to show my screen, so everybody bear with me here just for a moment. Okay, everybody see a webinar?
Yes.
You guys. Okay, cool. All right, good deal. So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Really appreciate you all being willing to listen to this topic today, because I have to say it's not a super cheery one, but we will try to come up with some action moments today and really just try to highlight what this crisis sounds like and what this looks like. So to kind of start today though, something I normally like to gauge when I actually have an audience in front of me is how many of you have actually heard of the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Peoples Crisis or the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Crisis, or however you may have heard this acronym? So we do have a poll because I am just curious that John is going to launch. So
yep, I just launched it.
Okay, awesome.
And the questions or the answers are rolling in.
Alrighty.
Like we have about 80% who have voted.
Awesome. Okay, and so overwhelmingly, I'm actually really glad to see this because I can tell you that about a year ago, when I was doing presentations like this and I mentioned the missing and murdered crisis, most of the time folks were, I would say, have you heard of this? And I would get no hands. I would get maybe 1 or 2 for the non-native community that would say, yes, I've heard of that. And most of the time it was very surface level things. So I'm really humbled and glad in a sense that I can see here that 71% of you are reporting that you have heard of this before. And so again, that really does say that we have come a long way in the last year to try and raise awareness for this issue and to try and start this process where we're actually addressing it. So that's actually really great. And for the 29% of you who haven't heard of this, that is totally fine. This presentation is really geared toward getting you up to speed, helping you guys understand this crisis, helping look at it from different perspectives, and really try to start how do we move forward. So I usually like to start off this process that even if you've only heard the acronym, sort of talking about like, well, what is the missing and murdered crisis, or what do you mean when you say MMIP or MMIWG? And so really, this crisis can be in reference to three different things. So one component is the awareness movement. So the awareness movement actually started in Canada. It's found its way down here to the US and is really starting to gain momentum. I do want to be very clear, we're talking about the awareness movement, so actually talking about this crisis, not the crisis itself. The crisis itself has actually been happening for well over 500 years, and we will get into that. 2018 was the first year in which the US actually declared that May 5th is the National Day of Awareness for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. This date was to honor Hannah Harris. She was a Northern Cheyenne Nation citizen. She was a young mother. She was an incredible young woman who unfortunately went missing and was subsequently found to have been murdered. And her family has really been at the forefront of trying to address this crisis, of trying to raise awareness, and really is trying to communicate to the world that they don't want this to happen to other women and girls and other Indigenous people. And so they have just done a tremendous job of trying to raise awareness for this and really talking about their experiences and how they were treated, because a lot of it is definitely not ideal. Common awareness sort of imagery or wording you may hear. So we talked about, the acronyms. You may see these as hashtags. MMIW, MMIWG, MMIR typically refers to missing and murdered Indigenous relatives. You may see things like no more stolen sisters or no more stolen relatives, invisible no more, or different terminology like that. You will see a lot of red dresses. So you may be able to see here that I'm actually wearing red dress earrings. So this is a symbol that is often used when we talk about MMIWG. Red handprints are also something that's very common. You may have seen a woman by the name of Jordan Marie Daniel. She is a runner and an activist who actually ran the Boston Marathon a couple years ago. And for each mile of that marathon, she did it in prayer and in remembrance of an MMIWG victim. And she had a red handprint across her face to help kind of raise that imagery and sort of promote that. So these are all really common images you may see. So especially around May, if you see a red dress hanging in a tree or something, that's not necessarily, it's supposed to shock you in a sense, but it's really to commemorate our missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. MMIP can be in reference to the data crisis that we have on our hands. So the reality of the matter is that we don't have a good, accurate number of how many of our relatives are missing. And what I mean by that is when we look, for instance, at the National Crime Information Center, they were actually looking at their reports in 2016 and found well over 5,700 reports of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. NamUs, the National Persons Missing Database, only logged 116 of those cases. So we have a huge gap and discrepancy that we're having to try and close when it comes to just really trying to assess this problem and actually get a grip on what this looks like and how many are missing. And the reason that I point that out is to show also that in 2016, we were really starting to get a hold on this data crisis. I will say that in that time, NamUs has, there have been federal guidelines that have now updated NamUs. So for instance, prior to several congressional hearings, I know they weren't even tracking tribal affiliation, which I can speak as a Native person and say, if I go missing, I want my tribal affiliation logged, because that's going to be very important and helpful when we try to find what relation somebody may have when we're trying to help find them. They weren't tracking whether or not somebody went missing or if a body was found on tribal land. And you can imagine that's actually pretty important, especially when we're talking about jurisdiction or things like that. So NamUs has made those updates and we are starting to close that gap, but it still is a gap and it still is a lot of different databases not really talking to each other, and we have to try and find ways to better track that data. So in light of this information and the fact that we don't have a good grip on this data, the Urban Indian Health Institute actually released a study back in late 2018 trying to look at the scope of the data crisis problem and see, okay, well, what can we find and where do we think this is really occurring? And so they looked at 506 unique cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls across 71 US cities. And what they found that is relevant, especially to all of us here, is that the state of Nebraska ranks 7th in the top 10 US states for the highest number of MMIWG cases. And the city of Omaha, Nebraska, where I currently live, ranked 8th in the top 10 US cities for the highest number of MMIWG cases. I don't know about the rest of y'all, but that doesn't make me feel so great. And so when we talk about this data crisis, a lot of people have questions about, well, why is it that we're not tracking this very well? How did we get to this point? How do we have so many cases that may be missing, or we don't have a good number? And this is actually attributed to several different problems. Things like poor record keeping and racial misclassification. So oftentimes people have an image in their head of what a Native American actually looks like. And when we find someone, they may or may not actually classify them correctly in the system. So for instance, if I was found, I would probably not be classified as a Native American. A lot of us as Native people do not look like a stereotype. We can be very white passing. Some of us are Afro-Indigenous, so we are Black and Indigenous. Some folks oftentimes get misrepresented as Latino or Asian in the system when that's not actually true. And so it's very important that we recognize that Native Americans don't always look the way you think we do. And so again, we don't have a good accurate number on this. There are also links to underreporting contributing to the data crisis, as well as this often is attributed to poor relationships with law enforcement. So for instance, a lot of times what families hear when they would try to report their loved one as missing, they would oftentimes, we've heard reports across Indian country, they would be met with responses like, well, she's probably just out partying. Well, she's probably just out drinking. Well, we can't file a missing persons report until it's been 24, 48, 72, insert some arbitrary number here that's actually not true. Or, well, we don't really have the resources to go look for them, so if you want to go look for them, you're going to have to go do it yourself. And that's actually what Hannah Harris's family had to do. They did not receive any support from law enforcement when they tried to report her as missing, and they were the ones who actually had to lead the efforts to go find her. And so that's not to say that that's happening everywhere across Indian country, but that is to say that these reports have come in enough times that there is a very significant concern. And so we have to keep that in mind, that when we hear things like that and when families don't think they're going to get the support or they're not going to be believed, they are more likely to underreport. And then finally, MMIP can be in reference to the crisis itself. So the reasons why our relatives and our people are going missing at such high rates. And the reality of the matter is again, because we have a lack of accountability, because we need more data, we still have a lot of questions about some of the causes and why this continues to happen. But from what we do know is that the CDC reports that murder is the 3rd leading cause of death for Native women in the United States. Violence on some reservations, I want to be very clear, some reservations, not all reservations, can be 10 times higher than the national average. And we also know that there's very little research done on Native Americans like myself who live in urban areas. We are often a very ignored group when we talk about Native communities, despite the fact that over 70% of Native Americans in the US live in urban areas or off reservations. I've actually had to deal with the question I received that because I don't live in Oklahoma anymore, well, then that means you're not Native anymore. And that's not true. And so we have to start to try and address what constitutes a Native American and how we sort of get better at tracking some of this data. And then MMIP is also attributed to things like intimate partner violence. So for instance, we'll talk about that here in just a little bit. The sex trafficking and human trafficking crisis, especially of Native women and young girls. It can be attributed to things like jurisdiction issues. Oftentimes, when somebody goes missing on tribal land, there's a lot of questions about, well, who's responsible for following up? And sometimes law enforcement agencies don't necessarily want to take the responsibility for that. And this is all across the United States. There's a lot of questions that come into play about who actually do you report to and who actually has the responsibility and liability to follow that up. And oftentimes you're kind of left in limbo with nobody really wanting to take that on. We oftentimes see differences in investigative treatment for Native cases. Like I had mentioned prior with Hannah Harris's family, that was, like I said, a real eye-opening story to come out, that when you try to report, you're not treated with the same respect or with the same confidence as maybe, for instance, if a non-Native white family were to report one of their loved ones as missing. And then we also see a lack of media coverage. And then in addition to that, a lack of respect in media coverage. So for instance, oftentimes, you hear, maybe you've heard about this in the news like a couple of times, or maybe you've heard about a famous case like Hannah Harris or Savannah Graywind. But oftentimes you don't hear about the larger numbers. And a lot of coverage in terms of raising awareness for this has actually come out of the Indigenous community, and especially on social media. We have really been working hard on those platforms to try and ensure that people know when someone is missing. When I talk about a lack of, or a disrespect in a sense, to how Native missing cases are treated, I can tell you I was in a seminar back in May for an kind of MMIWG Awareness Day, and there was a family that shared that their loved one went missing. They reported it, and the FBI actually did print a poster trying to raise awareness that she was missing. And the media took it up, and unfortunately the way it was portrayed was that she was a criminal, and it used, I believe, a mugshot. And the family had to come back and say, whoa, 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 what are you doing? She's not a criminal. She's not on the run. She's missing. We can't find her. And I think in that case, they were fearful that an intimate partner had harmed her. And it took a lot of time to convince them that they needed to portray that in a more sympathetic manner, and why it mattered that you portray it in a more sympathetic manner. But think about the lost time that you have trying to argue that we want people to look for her, not avoid her if they see her. But with all of this, I think it's very important to point out that this is nothing new. So if you're sitting there, I want everybody first to take a big deep breath, because I know that was a lot. So oftentimes the question after we kind of talk about what this crisis looks like and how this is going on, a lot of people will then ask me, well, why is this happening? Why are Native people going missing? Why is this such a crisis that we need to care about? And I think it's important to kind of ground us in historical context. And so I want to take us back to before colonization, before 1492, and that guy got lost on a boat or what have you, and to talk about what it looked like in tribal communities prior to that Western European contact. And so what we find is that prior to that Western European contact, that there was this very inherent balance in a lot of tribal communities. I want to be very clear, I'm speaking for the majority of tribal communities, not all tribal communities, as I certainly don't speak for all of them. But there was this inherent balance that was based on this mutual respect and responsibility between men, women, and tribal people. We find that women in particular were respected and valued leaders of the tribe. They were considered to be sacred, and this is often due to their likeness to the earth. So very much in the way that the earth gives and sustains our lives, women have that same power, and that is something to be respected and to be valued. Our two-spirit relatives, so for those of you who may not be familiar with the term two-spirit is often a gender identity that is associated, very similar if we're talking about the LGBTQIA+ community. Two-spirit could be, is often associated with a gender identity that Native people could hold, and this had several different manifestations from tribe to tribe, so two-spirit is more of a modern day term, but those individuals were also respected and valued leaders who had very important ceremonial roles, and they were the only ones in a lot of cases who could handle certain ceremonies. So it's all of that to say that violence was not tolerated in tribal communities against each other. It's very important to recognize that, and that's not to say that we lived in this kind of perfect utopia where violence never occurred, but when it did occur, it was handled very differently. So first and foremost, perpetrators were held accountable for their actions. Survivors were believed, they were supported, they were consulted on what needed to happen to help with their healing. punishment could range anywhere from being banished from the tribe, ostracized from the tribe, having to pay some kind of restitution to the victim or their family. And violent men were seen as being incapable of being leaders. If you couldn't control yourself, if you couldn't protect our women and our two-spirit individuals and all members of the tribe, you had no business making decisions on behalf of the tribe. And so we see that and we keep that in mind. So then when we have Western European contact and we have colonization is here, we start to see a shift from this. And so, like I said, when I mentioned that this is nothing new, it's very important that we recognize that Native people, and especially Native women, have been raped, bought, sold, kidnapped, traded, and exploited since the time of European colonization, since 1492, since that guy got lost on a boat. You're just now kind of starting to hear about this. We saw that Western European colonizers recognized that tribes put so much value in their women and in their people that that's where we start to see rape and violence being used against Native women and Native people as tools of destruction and colonization, all in this effort to quote unquote conquer tribal populations. And so what we start to see is the shift where assimilation and this mentality that they have to adapt to these Western European patriarchal societal norms, those have to be adopted in order to stop this violence and in order to ensure our survival long term. So this is where we start to see that women no longer are leaders making decisions on behalf of the tribe. We see a lot of our two-spirit relatives being ostracized or not being accepted and welcomed. We see, for instance, in my tribal culture, the women actually are the ones who hold the property, so to speak. I always joke with my husband that when I divorce him, I'm gonna just set his stuff outside and, you know, then that's our Cherokee divorce kind of thing. But we start to see that because of this assimilation practices in order to stop the violence, that's no longer a thing. Women no longer hold that power. And we continue to see this not just with first Western European contact, but we continue to see this with US federal policy in relation to tribes. So we can see this through several distinct eras of federal policy, through the era of removal. So this is where tribes were taken from their original homeland, they were placed somewhere else. This is how my tribe wound up from our original homelands in the Georgia, Tennessee, Carolinas area, and we found our way in Oklahoma. We see this in the era of reservation. So this is your plot of land, you don't leave. If you leave, you get in trouble. Those of you here in Nebraska may be familiar with the story of Chief Standing Bear. The Ponca tribe of Nebraska was removed down to Oklahoma from their original homelands on the Niobrara. Chief Standing Bear left the reservation, and that was the grounds that he was arrested under, because you're not supposed to leave. We see this through the era of assimilation. So this federal policy that is literally mandated by this mentality of quote unquote, kill the Indian and save the man. This mentality that being Native is not acceptable, that you will be white, or at least any form of white acceptability. We saw this stemming out of this, the boarding school era, for instance. So Native children were literally kidnapped from their homes, kidnapped from their families, sent to primarily Western European Christian-run boarding schools, and experienced high rates of physical, emotional, sexual, and psychological abuse. And a lot of the times we lost our Native children, and Native children could have been adopted out, or we never heard from them again. That was absolutely part of this missing and murdered problem. We also see this in the era of termination. So there was a time where the US government, I usually like to phrase it as, okay, they've tried everything. They have removed you from your home. They have taken you from they have put you on reservations. They have tried to assimilate you, and oh my God, you guys are still here. You know what, fine, we're gonna terminate you. You guys don't exist as a tribe anymore. That's not a thing anymore. This is actually what happened to the Ponca tribe of Nebraska. They were terminated as a federally recognized tribe and were not re-recognized until 1990. And they have been working tirelessly to get back a lot of what they lost. Currently, we are hypothetically in the era of self-determination. So we saw this with the passage of the Indian Civil Rights Act, the Indian Religious Freedom Act, and the Indian Self-Determination Act. Hypothetically, it is safer and more open for us to be Native people today than it was ever before. So for instance, I usually provide the example that my grandfather used to have to go to powwow in secret. He was not able to participate culturally in a public manner. I, however, wear my tribal jewelry. I speak my tribal language. I can go to ceremony. I can go to powwow and be freely and openly myself. And I'm very grateful for that and that privilege. But that's not to say that everything is solved, everything is resolved. There are still groups and there are still efforts to try and eliminate us as tribal people, to try and eliminate our tribal culture, and to eliminate our tribal sovereignty. But aesthetically, we are in a better era. If you're sitting there and you're thinking, "Oh my, that was a lot," and that's got to be taking a toll over the long term, you would absolutely be right. And so this mentality and this concept of all of this cumulative emotional, psychological wounding, when we look at it across lifespans and generations, emanating in this massive group trauma, when we look at everything that's happened over the last 500 years and how it can still have an impact today, this is a concept known as historical trauma. You may have heard of a historical trauma, and you may have also heard of intergenerational trauma. Historical trauma is typically looking at the group overall. So looking at the Native community, we can also see this with the Black community and African American community. We can see this with the Latino community. Like, we can see historical trauma in several different marginalized communities. Intergenerational trauma is looking at trauma across generations in one family. So for instance, what happened to the grandparents that then impacted the parents, that then impacted the children and the grandchildren, and so on and so forth. We can see this in how the boarding school era affected our grandparents' generation, and then we can see how that impacted the next generation, and so on and so forth. But it's very important to recognize that Native Americans have experienced and continue to experience trauma and events that contribute to this trauma. So for instance, I mentioned targeted legislation. There has literally been targeted legislation to terminate and eliminate our tribal sovereignty, to take away our tribal lands, to assimilate our tribal members. And it also has roots in the high rates of violence and suicide and poverty and substance abuse that we continue to experience today. So oftentimes folks will say, well, I don't understand, how can you say that 500 years ago something happened and it's still impacting you today? It's important to recognize that yes, it still has an impact, but it's a continuous cycle that we continue to experience. One of these that we will focus on that has a direct relation to the MMIP problem, and especially with the violence that we see today, is we're going to talk about intimate partner violence. So it's important to recognize that in today's context, more than 4 in 5 natives, both women and men, will experience some form of violence in their lifetime. 56% of Native women will experience violence in a given year. 55% of Native women will experience rape or violence by an intimate partner. Almost half of Native women who experience violence have been victims of stalking. This in particular gives me a lot of concern, especially when we see the high prevalence rate of stalking as an indicator or a precursor to intimate partner homicides. So when we talk about the missing and murdered component for this crisis. But it's important to recognize that Native Americans are 2.5 times as likely to experience violent crimes, and which is more than any other race or ethnicity group in the United States. Something else that is really important to recognize is oftentimes I get the question, well, who's perpetrating this violence, or what does this violence look like? And most of the time when we look at intimate partner violence and we look at demographic breakdowns, when we look at the race or ethnicity category, most of the time in the majority of cases, not all cases, but the majority, what we find is that the perpetrator and the victim tend to be in the same race or ethnicity group, except when we look at natives. When we look at Native victims, so in 97% of cases for Native women and 90% of cases for Native men in which they were victims of violence, they're perpetrators, they're rapists, they're abusers, they're traffickers, were actually not Native. And that's very important that we have that context in mind as we try to move forward in addressing this. When we talk about human trafficking, we don't have a lot of great data just because, given the nature of human trafficking. But what we do know is that here in Nebraska, it is estimated that 900 individuals are trafficked for sex every month in the state of Nebraska. That's not times, that's people. So this is a crisis that is hitting here for us home in Nebraska. And while, again, like I said, you know, the very nature of trafficking is very elusive, it's very difficult to track at times. There was a study that was conducted across several cities in the US and Canada, and what they found is that in an average of 40% of sex trafficking victims, 40% were Native women. So we see a huge disproportionality when we talk about who is also being impacted by this. And important context to note there is that Native women only represented 10% or less of the general population in those areas, yet they're representing 40% of the sex trafficking victims. And Native Americans in general are considered a very vulnerable population to be trafficked. This is attributed to several different factors, such as the fracking industry's man camps. So for those of you who may not be aware of what a man camp is, man camps are these worker camps that tend to pop up around the pipeline and oil industry. They tend to pop up in rural, isolated areas, oftentimes near tribal lands, if the pipeline is going in that area. And they are a hotbed for the trafficking of drugs, sex, and people. And oftentimes what we see is that, especially when they are near a tribal lands or a tribal population, that we often see a huge increase in violence against Native people, and we often see the trafficking of Native people. The National Human Trafficking Hotline also found that when we're looking at this, it's important to note that our youth are at risk. Almost 40% of their cases, when they were looking at their cases from 2011 to 2017 that involved a Native American trafficking victim, almost 40% involved a Native American child, involved a minor. And it's also important to note that a lot of the different factors that are contributing to this have to do with poverty. There's a really great study that I highly recommend you all check out. It's known as the Garden of Truth study. This study was conducted in around the Minneapolis area in Minnesota, and they interviewed 105 Native women who had been trafficked for sex. And the huge rates of physical abuse, of traumatic brain injury, of sexual abuse and exploitation, of childhood sexual trauma, all of this was well within 70 to 90% of these women. One important factor and statistic, though, to point out, especially when we're talking about housing, is that 98% of those women had experienced or were experiencing homelessness at the time that they were interviewed. So it's very important that we have all of this context when we're talking about these concerns. To give you a little more context in terms of Nebraska-specific concerns, we know that when we talk about the missing and murdered crisis, or when we talk about trafficking, there is a huge disproportionality of Native children in the child welfare system. So when we look at the top 5 states that have a huge disproportionality of Native children involved in the child welfare system, we find that Nebraska consistently ranks in the top 5. I always have to say that's not something to brag about. And the reason that I bring up the child welfare system is because oftentimes that is a targeted entity for traffickers or for individuals who want to cause harm. Because oftentimes, you know, our Native children, especially those who get lost in the system, we lose them in the system, or oftentimes traffickers will seek them out and will say, like, hey, I'll take care of you, I'll love you, and try to lure them away in that manner. So it's very important that we recognize that. In Nebraska, there was a study actually conducted by the Sovereign Bodies Institute in which they were looking at Nebraska, the Dakotas, and Montana, so all 3 states that do have pipelines going through them, to see what this crisis looked like in relation to that. And so in Nebraska, Indigenous girls represent 13% of all missing children, of all missing girls in the state, excuse me. Yet they only represent 1% of the state's population. So again, we have that huge disproportionality that we're dealing with in terms of targeting. They also found in that study that over half of MMIWG cases that they studied involved girls under the age of 18. 2/3 of the cases are unsolved. Nearly half of the alleged perpetrators were never charged, never convicted. And 2/3 of all alleged perpetrators were not Native. So again, this is giving that context to, we have a problem here in Nebraska. We have a situation on our hands that we have to start to address. This isn't something that happens once in a blue moon that we can ignore. We are absolutely responsible for this. This is one of the images that actually came from that study that I just mentioned. Again, I highly recommend checking that out. Just really talking about, and they, one of their lead researchers is very involved in cartography and looking at maps and how all of that works. So just trying to give a breakdown and give an understanding to the fact that this is very much at our doorstep. And so I want to just to kind of give sort of a wrap up for this kind of section when we talk about historical context and we talk about all the different factors that are coming into play. I think it's really important that we keep in mind how all of these factors are working together. And so this is a really great quote that I'm going to paraphrase from the Garden of Truth study that I mentioned, where they interviewed 105 Native women who had been trafficked for sex. And so talking about the people who are marginalized because of colonialism's devastating historical impact, because of their lack of opportunities and education, because of race and ethnic discrimination, poverty, previous physical and emotional harm and abandonment, are the people who are most often exploited, people who have the fewest real choices available to them. The critical question asked with respect to the women that they interviewed is not, did she consent, but has she been offered the real choice to exist without it? And so I think it's really important that that quote just does a fantastic job of encapsulating all of this. The fact that there is historical context for why we're in the situation that we're in, but also recognizing the very real current circumstances that are grounding us here in the present moment. Additional factors to consider. So like I had mentioned, you know, the huge disproportionality of Native children in the foster care system and the separation of Native families. This can oftentimes contribute to losing our children or not knowing where they are, or oftentimes, like I mentioned, kids are targeted in the foster care system. In Nebraska, Native children are 2.5 times more likely to be placed in foster care than non-Native families and non-Native children. And this is with ICWA in place. So for those of you who may not be aware, ICWA stands for the Indian Child Welfare Act, which was an effort to try and stop the removal of children from their culture, from their families, and recognizing their inherent tribal sovereignty as tribal citizens, but really trying to uplift ICWA and trying to support it, because there are folks who are trying to eliminate it. 32.6% of natives in Nebraska also have household incomes at or below the federal poverty level. And 41.2% of those Native American households are female-led. So this is 2 to 2.5 times higher than the Nebraska population overall, where the median household income for Native Americans in Nebraska is over 45% lower than the average. So again, when we're talking about poverty, when we're talking about a lot of the different, you know, systems in place that are continuing to cause crises like this, it's important to recognize how poverty is coming into play with that, how housing and not having access to safe housing comes into play with that. It's also something to highlight that Native Americans also face some of the highest rates of substance abuse, especially for our youth. Alcohol abuse was reported in 69% of Native youth aged 15 to 24 who were admitted for substance abuse treatment. And having access to, again, safe housing, having access to community support services, having access to healing services and medical care, all of that is feeding into this, because otherwise I have to deal with the response that when we try to raise awareness for this, there's often a stigma that's associated where people will try to write people off because they have the substance abuse problem. They're still worthy of looking for it. They are still worthy of finding, and they still deserve care and love and support and safety, regardless of the problems that we all face in daily life. Everybody has problems. And it's important to recognize that that doesn't make you any less deserving. And it also means that you deserve access to resources to help. So, okay, one more quick deep breath. Just everybody take a minute. We are going to start to move a little more positive. My presentations tend to go like pretty negative, and then we go down, 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 and then I promise we will go back up. So talking about Nebraska in terms of our tribal communities and in terms of talking about what are people doing? How are we trying to address this crisis here? So I want to first talk about what does it mean to make up a what does it mean to be a Native American? What does it mean to be a tribal citizen? And the reason that I point this out is, again, because we've talked about how racial misclassification feeds into this. We've talked about jurisdiction problems. So trying to give a little bit of context for what does this actually mean when I introduce myself as a tribal person. So I really like that the National Congress of the American Indian has kind of given us 4 components that go into what makes up a tribal nation. So the first and foremost are our people, our citizens of our tribal nation. Without our people, we're nothing, right? It's how we see this very fierce protection of our youth and trying to maintain our youth with their culture and trying to ensure, because our youth are our future, that they have a future with knowledge of their tribal culture and knowledge of their people. It's why, especially with COVID-19, we have been very aware and on top of trying to make sure that we address that crisis and that we keep our elders safe, because our elders are our knowledge keepers, and we want to make sure that they stay safe and stay healthy so that they can continue to pass that on to us. There is a cultural component. So again, like I said, our elders are our knowledge keepers and especially our culture keepers. But tribal culture involves everything from our language to our art, our jewelry, our ceremonies, our traditions, our family structures, whether or not we are a matrilineal or a patrilineal society and how things get passed down. All of that makes us inherently unique. There are 574 federally recognized tribes in the United States, and to tell you this, all of us are inherently unique, and that is something to be celebrated, and that's what our culture gives us. There is a governance component, so recognizing that we as tribal nations are sovereign governments. I actually got married last year, and my marriage license is issued through my tribal nation, so not the state of Oklahoma, not any other state in the United States or anyone else, but Cherokee Nation, because they have a right to do so as a tribal government. And that is, again, something that we have to honor and something that we have to recognize, is that inherent power and authority in our sovereignty. And then there's a land component. So this is meant from both a physical sense, so like our land holdings, our reservation boundaries, our tribal jurisdiction, but also in a spiritual sense. So there are a lot of tribes that believe we were placed on our original homelands to protect them and to preserve them for future generations, so not taking more than we need. That's why you often see, and we talk about Native people being the stewards of this land before Western European contact, that we preserved it, and you'll often see that when we talk about environmental concerns or eco-conscious efforts that try to recognize that inherent sovereignty of Native people in protecting this land. So when we talk about the 4 tribes in Nebraska, the tribes of Nebraska, there are 4 tribal nations that are headquartered in Nebraska. So this is the Omaha tribe of Nebraska and Iowa. And I apologize that I can't say Iowa. I am from Oklahoma and I do have a slight twang. But the Omaha tribe is headquartered in Macy, Nebraska, on the Omaha Tribes Reservation. The Ponca tribe of Nebraska, which is headquartered in Niobrara, Nebraska, they do not actually have a reservation. They have a service delivery area that spans 15 counties in Nebraska, and I believe it's 2 or 3 counties in Iowa and 1 county in South Dakota. So they very much handle civil jurisdiction and basically span their services throughout that service delivery area. The Santee Sioux Nation, which is headquartered on the Santee Reservation, which is near Niobrara, Nebraska, but is not Niobrara, it's Santee. And then the Winnebago tribe of Nebraska, which is headquartered in Winnebago, Nebraska, on the Winnebago tribe reservation, which is near the Omaha tribe reservation. Other tribes that have land in Nebraska, so they are headquartered in other states, but they do have land holdings here in Nebraska, is the Ogallala Lakota Nation. For the Ogallala Sioux tribe, they are headquartered in Pine Ridge, South Dakota. The Iowa tribe of Kansas and Nebraska, headquartered in White Cloud, Kansas, and the Sac and Fox Nation of Missouri and Kansas and Nebraska, headquartered in Reserve, Kansas. So all of these different tribal nations, it's important to have that context and to be aware of who has land holdings here and who can we possibly work with when we're trying to assist in addressing this crisis. But it's also important to recognize that Native people from all over, we have a very diverse group here in Nebraska. So for instance, I have connected with a group of Cherokee Nation citizens like myself who live in Nebraska now. We have people from all different kinds of tribes, and it's important to recognize that as well when we look at our urban areas. You may have heard, so when we talk about sort of current efforts and recent efforts, you may have heard of Nebraska LB 154. So this was legislation in Nebraska that was introduced back in January of last year. Feels like forever ago, but it was introduced by Senator Tom Brewer and State Senator Patty Pansing-Brooks, and it was really coming out of something that was known as the White Clay Task Force. So for those of you who may not be aware, the White Clay Task Force was to address a problem that was happening up in White Clay, which is a town that sits on the border of Nebraska and South Dakota near the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. And basically what was found up there was that there were several liquor stores, so to speak, that were selling, I can't even give you the number, obscene amount of alcohol, and especially preying on the Native community in that area. Those liquor stores have since been shut down, but coming out of White Clay, you saw a lot of violence and poverty and issues. And so while the efforts were successful for that task force, Judy Goshkabas, who is the executive director for the Nebraska Commission on Indian Affairs for the state, she was like, but we still have work to do. And so that's where LB 154, which was legislation to address the missing and murder, or I'm sorry, the missing Native women and children crisis here in Nebraska, came out of. So this actually passed the legislature in June 1st. Those recommendations did not pass in June 1st. I apologize. The report was submitted this last June 1st. But basically, Nebraska State Patrol and the Commission on Indian Affairs and several other groups were basically working together to try and start to address this problem. So we did see a report that came out of that. It was very heavily skewed towards law enforcement response to missing persons cases. So I want to be very clear that this was a first step. It was a good step in the right direction, but we still have a lot more work to do, and we certainly, with the Nebraska Commission on Indian Affairs, will continue to move forward to address things like poverty, to look at ways to establish different task forces for looking at, child abuse and substance abuse and suicide and poverty and neglect, looking at things like intimate partner violence, domestic violence, trafficking, how all of that feeds into this problem. So again, really emphasizing that it's very nice to live here in Nebraska where people are taking this seriously. People do recognize that we have a problem and are starting to take those steps to actually try to address it. As I start to wrap up here today, and before we start to get to questions, do want to highlight some of the resources that are available, especially when we look at intimate partner violence and violence that is occurring in Native communities. So Nebraska-specific tribal domestic violence programs, these are all of the phone numbers. If you are a direct service provider, I highly recommend taking a screenshot, or you should have access to this video after today so that you can get folks in contact that you may be working with if they are in need of these in need of these services. I work with all 4 of these tribal domestic violence programs. They are absolutely fantastic. They really are groups that go above and beyond for their clients and trying to ensure safety. Statewide resources that are available, the Nebraska Urban Indian Health Coalition. They have 2 offices, one in Omaha, one in Lincoln, really focused on supporting the Native communities there. They do a fantastic job and always try to raise awareness for missing and murdered crisis and providing direct services to Native people in those areas. Nebraska Commission on Indian Affairs, which I'll get to here in just a moment. And then if you leave here today with nothing else, I do highly recommend that you write down this phone number for the Strong Hearts Native Helpline. So this is a national domestic violence hotline focused on providing anonymous service and advocacy to Native survivors of violence. This hotline has been active for going on about 3 or 4 years now. I personally am a survivor of intimate partner violence. I wish this had been around when I was in those first stages, but it is just a fantastic resource that if at the very least somebody is contemplating getting help or needs help finding services, they can get it from this helpline. So to talk a bit on the Nebraska Commission on Indian Affairs, so we are the state liaison for Nebraska's tribal nations and basically trying to recognize issues that Native people face here in Nebraska and how to address that through a government-to-government relationship. So like was mentioned earlier, I am the commissioner for the city of Omaha with NCIA. This is the website and the phone number. Judy Goshkabas is the executive director. She has a great team with her that is always willing to chat and to talk about ways that we can try to assist Native communities and Native people. And then there's also Legal Aid of Nebraska. So this is who I work with. So we are a statewide nonprofit law firm providing free legal service to people who typically don't have access to an attorney. We have 8 offices throughout the state of Nebraska, including an office in Omaha and Lincoln. We also have a housing justice project that is looking to ensure client populations have access to safe, habitable, and affordable housing statewide. So anyone at risk of loss of housing or is without safe or habitable housing, we absolutely recommend that they apply for services. We have that statewide access line here that folks can call. I just realized I forgot to include it here, but I will try to find it quickly. We also have a COVID-19 access hotline, so we know that a lot of folks are facing housing crises right now with the COVID-19 crisis in conjunction. So our housing justice project has been doing a fantastic job of really trying to address that and trying to make sure folks stay safe right now and can have safe housing. And then within Legal Aid of Nebraska as well, we have our Native American program, which I work under. So we provide free legal service to enrolled or enrollment eligible Native Americans with issues here in the state of Nebraska. So they don't have to be part of a Nebraska tribe, but we will provide assistance. So for instance, if I had an issue, because I'm a tribal citizen, I could still get assistance because I am here in Nebraska. Through that, we also have a domestic violence initiative, which is where we have made it a top priority area that we will serve Native survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, human trafficking, dating violence, and stalking for legal matters pertaining to their victimization. So for instance, if they need access and help getting a protection order, or if they need assistance with getting divorce or custody of their children from their abuser. Oftentimes, we have, especially lately, been getting a lot of calls about housing and trying to make sure that if a landlord is trying to evict a victim, that we hopefully don't do that because that's not what the protection order says. So trying to just really emphasize and support Native survivors of violence in any way that we can. We have 2 ways that folks can get in touch with us. So we have our Native American Access Line, which is a phone line that folks can call to fill out an application. We also have an online application that will go to legal aid and will get dispersed from there. Paralegals will follow up and come back through to start that assistance. Wanted to include Judy's contact information just because she is a fantastic resource. And also my contact information. So if you leave here today and you have questions or something I didn't get to, or you want to learn more about how you can assist, or you want more presentations for your organization, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm always more than happy to assist and always happy to answer questions. So you guys will have that. And then just kind of as we wrap up and move into questions, I just want to say thank you all so much for sitting tight and hanging with us as we talk about this. I know this can be a very difficult subject and a very difficult topic to go over. So I really just appreciate you all listening and watching. And again, if you have any questions or anything, please feel free to ask me. Okay.
Thank you very much, Kirby. Wow. Yeah, like you said, I appreciate you hand-holding us throughout that process. But we do very much appreciate all of your efforts that you are doing across the country. Elizabeth, do you want to, I have the questions pulled up. Do you have something you'd like to say before?
I just really want to thank Kirby for participating today. This was supposed to be a keynote presentation at our annual event, and so I appreciate her making time for us. And then also appreciate all the people that took time to attend this today. I know it's a topic that's a little outside of our wheelhouse, but I think Kirby did an excellent job touching on what affordable housing means in regards to this issue, and you know, how we can all help out. And I just wanted to ask, as non-Native Americans, what do you see that we can do to help with this issue?
For sure. So I actually get this question a lot. And one of the best ways that I can explain it is to start by addressing responsibility. So there's a TED Talk out there by a woman named Nikki Sanchez. She is a First Nations Indigenous woman from Canada, and she has a whole talk about decolonization is for everyone. And she points out that this history and so all these terrible things that have happened across time, really emphasizing that this is not your fault, but they are absolutely your responsibility. So once we accept that we have a responsibility to deal with, the next question is usually, well, okay, so what is my responsibility? And this is where Faith Spotted Eagle really comes in her teachings. And so what Faith Spotted Eagle says is, and points out, is that my responsibility as an Indigenous person, my responsibility is to heal. So my responsibility is to address the direct trauma I've experienced and this historical trauma and try to find a way to heal so that I can lessen that effect on future generations, so that my kids and my grandkids don't have to go through what I went through, and so that they have to heal a little less than I do. For non-natives, she points out that it is your responsibility to not deny what has happened to us and to support our efforts to heal. So to not deny that this history has happened, to not deny that it is continuing to impact us today, because we talked about that, right? Like, we talked about how targeted genocide and assimilation in the past are continuing to impact us, and there are still current efforts like this that we're trying to address. And then from there, it's to listen to Indigenous communities. So something I notice is that when I talk about things like this, there is this mentality, and you all may have felt this urge that, especially from non-Native folks, they're like, oh my gosh, that is so heartbreaking. I want to help, and I want to help save. And while I really appreciate that sentiment, I really do, and I want you to hold on to that gut feeling, we don't need saving. We need you to listen to us. We need you to uplift our voices and highlight our causes. And I'm really appreciative that NIFA was willing to do that today, to highlight this problem that we're facing. We need you to support what we're saying when we say, this is a problem and this is how we're gonna heal. We don't need the problem solvers. We don't need saviors. We don't need anyone coming in trying to tell us how to heal or how to do better. We know what to do. We know what we need, I promise. But to be a true ally, you have to respect that and you have to support it. And so listening to people who are out there who can speak on this even better than I can, so uplifting their voices. So there are people, so I mentioned Jordan Marie Daniel. She is a fantastic runner and person who is providing awareness, uplifting her voice, and she has action items that people can partake in. Educating yourself. There's a wonderful woman by the name of Corinne Rice. She does fantastic lessons on social media talking about Native issues, and especially talking about trafficking and talking about the missing and murdered crisis. So really just trying to educate yourself and to uplift our voices so that we can start that healing process and so that we can move forward in life. And I think if we can all kind of accept that, we can all move forward together.
Thank you.
That was excellent.
No, that was great. So I do have some questions that came in.
Okay.
Looks like our first one is, can you talk about provisions in Violence Against Women Act that are relevant to MMIW? And if VAWA is expired currently, is that having an effect on MMIW cases?
Ooh, that is a really great question. I do need to preface and say that I'm not an attorney. I work for them. I'm married to one. I decided, you know, that's enough. So with VAWA, I'm sure, what you're probably getting at is the VAWA 2013 reauthorization, which did talk about and had more expansions to tribal jurisdiction. So the ability for tribal nations to prosecute certain acts of domestic violence. Those were very strict provisions. To my knowledge, they are still in effect. It does rely on a tribal nation to have to try to actually meet those requirements, because there were a lot of requirements. And that was, again, like with a lot of legislation we're seeing recently, that was a very good first step. We do know that we still have a lot of work to do. Yes, with VAWA expired currently, I mean, everything is still in effect. My job is still in effect, so we're good. It is recognizing that when we look at intimate partner violence, so just to kind of take a step out of VAWA, but when we're talking about holding people accountable, it is extremely important that we hold people accountable for their actions. It is extremely important that we send a message to the world that if you commit a crime in Indian country, if you commit a crime against a Native person, that you will be held accountable for those actions, whether that is through state jurisdiction, federal jurisdiction, or tribal jurisdiction. It is extremely important that we communicate that. And a lot of the reason that VAWA 2013 was worded the way it was is because there was a lot of mentality and action that was happening in which non-Native perpetrators felt, well, the rules don't apply to me. You can't come after me. There was a heartbreaking story that came out of that, where a Native woman was being physically assaulted by her intimate partner who was non-Native. He called the cops and he called tribal police and he called county police and said, who's gonna come get me? And nobody came. And so powerful stories like that, it's awful that that has to happen for people to take action. But it's recognizing that we have to have accountability and we have to have an ability to actually hold perpetrators accountable through whatever system to actually have the message get clear that you can't do this, that you're not going to get away with it, that our victims and our survivors can feel safe and can feel confident to come forward and to get assistance, or that the system is actually going to help them. I unfortunately have to talk with a lot of survivors who get tribal protection orders and they may or may not get enforced. Even though a tribal protection order has to be enforced in any jurisdiction, it has the same full faith and credit of any other document that comes from any other court. We still have to do a lot of training on that. And we have to talk with law enforcement agencies and we have to talk with courts and everything to say, no, this is a court document. It says that this person is safe and that this perpetrator cannot come in here. And so trying to uplift that. So I don't know if I fully answered your question. I apologize if I didn't. Feel free to email me if not. But just to kind of give you an idea of why this is so important, why we talk about this, and why we look toward things like that to try and build safer communities.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. Would you happen to know how to get help for people in Oklahoma?
I might. I would, given that I'm not sure what the issue is, I would say my first and foremost thing is to always reach out to the tribe that you're working with or to someone's tribal affiliation. So for instance, we've had people here in Nebraska who are not from a Nebraska tribe, and we've been able to assist them by reaching out to their tribe. And sometimes tribes will come help their tribal members, whether they live in their jurisdiction or not. I know that if I was suffering or was in another unsafe situation, I would still reach out to my tribe. Maybe they will be able to help, maybe they won't, but just trying to first make that connection with the respective tribe. And I know the tribal domestic violence programs do a fantastic job down there. Another great resource down there in Oklahoma is something known as the OKNAV, NAAV. That is the Oklahoma Natives Against Violence Coalition. And so they are a fantastic anti-violence coalition. I would highly recommend, depending on what the situation is, please contact them because they are a great resource and will have all the resources in Oklahoma that can assist.
Okay, yeah, I appreciate you with that suggestion. And it looks like that same person says thank you.
Okay.
And it looks like the rest of these are a lot of thank yous. Thank you so much. Thank you, Kirby, for the powerful presentation, your continued efforts to bring light to this terrible situation. And outstanding presentation. So many more need to be aware. I am more aware now. So that's great. The one thing that you had said that kind of hit a chord with me, I used to be a case manager and I worked with homeless folks, but when you mentioned people that are struggling with substance abuse still need safety, still need support, still need a home, I mean, that really touches on chronic homelessness and, addiction. And so I'm glad you mentioned that. So thank you.
For sure. Yeah. Oh, thank you. I'm glad that struck a chord because it's something that I gotta tell you guys, when I get a call from a relative who's trying to find their loved one and they say they won't take me seriously because they were an alcoholic or because they had a substance abuse problem, or because I have had a call where they said, well, she was being trafficked and, she was considered to be a prostitute, and they won't help and stuff. And it's just, one of the big things, and I'll try to leave you guys with anything, if I don't leave you with anything else again, is the need for compassion, and the need to look at the fact that whatever the situation you're in, if you're a direct service provider, if you're just a community member, whatever the situation is involved with somebody that you have in front of you, recognize that you have a person in front of you. And we have got to start leading with compassion. We have got to get some of that kindness back. We've got to get some of that empathy back. I know that's so hard right now in this very stressful world that we live in. I know that's really difficult, but one of the biggest frustrations I have as a service provider is, I call another service provider and they just say, well, I can't do anything and stuff. And I'm like, but you have a person who really needs help. And so just trying to kind of hold on to that, if that struck a chord with you or if that struck a chord with any of you, trying to hold on to that feeling of, I have a person in front of me and I have to try. So.
Yeah. Looks like we have another comment. Very impressive presentation. I learned a lot. I have half Native identical twin grandsons, and this helped me understand their dad's family dynamic more. I also work with a lot of Native persons and want to be able to be empathetic to their circumstances and advocate for them if necessary. So definitely getting some good feedback.
Sure.
Do you feel that there are any films, documentaries, or that kind of have captured the impact of this, or that you would recommend?
Oh, that's a really good question. So I would probably recommend, I'm going to stop showing my screen here so that I can pull, if I can see if I can find
You want to show your screen? I can.
No, I want to stop showing my screen.
Okay. Right now we can't see your screen, so.
Oh, great. Okay, good deal. Okay. So one of the films that I hear a lot about is, I know I've had quite a few people ask, is there's a dramatic, if you're looking for a dramatic interpretation of this, there's a film called Wind River. Wind River has pros and cons to it. It does portray sort of kind of a white savior narrative, and it does have some issues, but it was a very great film in the sense of it really got people to have that emotional connection, which is what dramatic films can help with, and dramatization. So that's one movie that you can look at. But if we're talking about documentaries, and we're talking about films that are actually going to better encapsulate this and are really going to talk about this crisis, one of the films that we as Legal Aid actually showed last year is a film called Highway of Tears. It is a documentary. It's about a stretch of highway in Canada, actually, because remember we talked about this awareness movement really started in Canada. But there's a stretch of highway where I can't even remember the number, but it is absolutely insane how many women in particular have gone missing on this stretch of highway, and especially Indigenous women up in Canada, and have been murdered and have been taken or have never been found. So that does a fantastic job of talking about the disproportionality involved, because again, it's very relevant down here in the US. And it does a really great job of talking about differences in investigative treatment and talking about media coverage. And it's by a guy named Matt Smiley. And he's non-native, but he has just such a heart for telling Native stories and for trying to raise awareness for issues like this. I know that there are a few that have come out or are coming out. I'm trying to think of Jordan's. Let me look this up. That's a really good question. I should have prepared for that.
Well, I have seen Wind River, and I was thinking about that. I should have mentioned it on our practice.
No, yeah, somebody just said that to me, and you might have, and I should have been prepared. But Jordan Marie Daniel, if you don't know her, I know she's working on several documentaries if she hasn't finished them already. But Jordan Marie Daniel is an incredible activist for MMIP. She is the one who does the running for justice, and is really highlighting and elevating stories, and is really trying to promote resources and trying to give folks an understanding of what this crisis looks like. She's also, I know her partner is also a documentarian, so they've done a lot of work together. I don't know if it's out yet. I think it's called Voices, but trying to find it. And
just the people that are still on, Susan in our office is putting all this information in the chat. So
awesome. Thank you, Susan. But yeah, Jordan Marie Daniel is fantastic. I know there was one with Sarah Deer. Other folks that you may look toward who are going to have more resources, who are going to be helpful. I mentioned Corinne Rice, Corrinne, I believe is how you spell it. She goes by on Instagram. That's where she does a lot of her stuff. Miss MISS Corinne. Oh, sorry, it's CORINNE 86. She's on Instagram, and she does a fantastic job of talking about trafficking. She actually lives in the Rosebud area, so not far from Nebraska. She's even come into Nebraska and done a lot of talks on trafficking and MMIP, but she does a great job. There are two other women who have really led national efforts. One of them is named Mary Catherine Nagel. She is a citizen of Cherokee Nation like myself. She is a lawyer and a playwright. She is amazing, but she really talks about VAWA, and she talks about why we have to get involved in the MMIP movement. And she does do, like I said, plays to kind of portray this. So she actually has a virtual showing for a play coming out that I can send you guys to send out to everybody else. It's called Sliver of a Full Moon, talking about violence against the Native community. So that would be something virtual that you guys could all tune into to learn more, and again, get that kind of dramatic portrayal involved with violence and get that emotional connection. And then another woman is by the name of Sarah Deer. She's actually a MacArthur Genius Fellow. She is Muskogee Creek. She is also an attorney. She actually is a professor down at KU, but she has a book called The Beginning and End of Rape, which talks about violence against Native women. And she also does a really great job of drawing that connection between what happened 500 years ago can continue to impact us today, and how that looks in a modern context. I know I'm giving you like all different media resources right now.
Okay.
If you guys are into podcasts, I have to pull up my phone here because there's a lot.
Kirby, what was the name of Sarah's book again?
The Beginning and End of Rape.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was super excited to hear that it's actually starting to be assigned in like college classes. So I'm really, yeah, it's great. If you are looking for a couple of different podcasts that are available for, I don't know if anybody's still commuting, but there is a podcast called Finding Cleo. FINDING Cleo, CLEO. There is a podcast called Not Invisible. That one really is from a group called the Red House series. They do a fantastic job of trying to highlight efforts to address this crisis. Going through my list.
I may have seen Miss Corinne 86. Did she maybe interview Mark Ruffalo from the actor when it was about voting? I may have seen a clip of her.
If it was a couple years ago, was it just recently or a couple years ago?
It was actually recently. I'm thinking I saw something about that, but I could be wrong. I will definitely look her up.
Is she?
Auntie Beaches.
Oh, maybe
That's what I was thinking of, Auntie Beatrice.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you. In fact, I think Elizabeth was the one that showed that to me. So.
Oh my gosh, yes. Mark Ruffalo is a great ally to the Indigenous community. We are very grateful for him. He does a fantastic job. But yeah, that I know exactly what clip you're talking about. Yeah, that is a comedian. She goes by the name of Auntie Beatrice.
Okay.
But Tanya Jo Hall is her name, and she does a fantastic job. But yeah, it's good.
Well,
Sometimes it's nice to get the word out about important issues through humor.
For sure, yes. Well, and I always kind of point out, you guys may have seen recently with the election, CNN called the Native community. There was like a demographic breakdown, and it had talked about white voters, Black voters, Latino voters, Asian voters, and then it had something else. And that was in reference to the Native community. And so while that was disheartening and a little angering, the Native community, through our humor, really ran with that and actually promoted, so many memes and TikToks and everything came out of that to try and laugh at, what's not a great situation and try to educate on that, so.
Yeah. Well, Elizabeth, is there any, I know I kind of wanted to do, remind people about webinars coming up, but were there any other things that you wanted to touch on? Or I think we've gone through all of our questions. Someone mentioned that there was a documentary about white clay, and I think I do remember that.
I think I do too.
Otherwise,
I don't have anything else. We really appreciate your time, and you did an excellent job, and we hope we can be supportive in your efforts going forward.
For sure, yes. Thank you guys again for allowing me to come chat with you today. If you do have any questions, whether it's now or later, please feel free to reach out to me through my contact information. I'm always more than happy to share resources.
all right, thank you very much, Kirby. So that does complete all the questions from today's presentation. I'd like to thank everyone for attending, and a special thank you again to Kirby. We do have a webinar coming up we're not having one next week because of Thanksgiving, but we do have one on Wednesday, December 2nd called Innovative Housing Ideas, which is going to feature some innovative housing projects in Kentucky, Wisconsin, and Chicago, and that's moderated by our friend Earl Redrick, the director of the Omaha Field Office for HUD. This webinar, along with all of our previous webinars, are recorded and available on our website, NIFA.org, under Community Development and Outreach and Action. And then you can go to our YouTube channel, which is NIFA Housing. We have a whole bunch of great webinars featuring a lot of different topics. So thank you to Kirby again and Elizabeth for being part of this today and for helping set this up. And I will say farewell until our next webinar.
Thank you, Kirby. Thanks, John.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thanks, guys. Stay safe and well.
Thank you.